They continued walking down the street in silence, the weight of the interaction still hanging in the air. Keanu wondered what the manager was doing now. Was she processing the reality of her mistake? Or had she brushed it off, assuming that someone like his wife didn't really matter? It wasn't that Keanu cared about the manager's opinion, but rather the culture that allowed such behavior to exist. They reached a small park at the end of the street, a quiet spot away from the bustle of the shopping district. Keanu and his wife found a bench near a fountain, the sound of running water providing a calming backdrop to the stillness around them. Keanu sat down first and gently patted the space beside him, inviting her to join him. She sat down, crossing her legs in a relaxed manner. She smiled at him, but there was a distant look in her eyes, as though she were still processing the situation. Keanu reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. He knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't one to openly share her feelings, especially when it came to moments like this. But he also knew that she wouldn't want him to avoid talking about it. "I didn't expect that," she said softly, her voice steady but with an underlying sense of disbelief. "I mean, I've been in situations like that before, but that felt different." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It's just frustrating, you know? The way people can so easily judge you based on how you look or how you present yourself. Like you're not even worthy of being treated with basic respect unless you fit into their idea of what's acceptable." Keanu nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I get it, but you handled it so well. You didn't let it get to you, and you made your point without making a scene. That's strength right there." He paused, looking out at the fountain, his fingers still gently tracing circles on her hand. "I wish more people could understand that sometimes it's not about how much money or status someone has. It's about who they are as a person." His wife smiled faintly, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. "I know you understand, Keanu, and I'm grateful for that. But I wish it wasn't like this. I wish that people didn't make assumptions based on the smallest details. It makes everything feel so shallow." Keanu turned to face her fully, his eyes soft with empathy. "I know, but it's not always about changing other people's minds. Sometimes it's about knowing who you are and standing strong in that. You've done that your whole life." She squeezed his hand in return, her gaze softening. "I guess you're right. It's just hard when those kinds of things happen, and it feels like there's nothing I can do about it." "You don't have to do anything," Keanu said, his voice firm but gentle. "You just have to be yourself. That's enough." There was a quiet pause between them, the noise of the city a distant hum in the background. As they sat together in silence, Keanu couldn't help but wonder what would come of this. Would the manager change her behavior after today? Would she think twice before passing judgment on someone again? He doubted it, but he couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, this encounter would have some lasting impact on her, or anyone who witnessed what had happened. But for now, he was content to be in the moment with his wife, offering her the comfort and support she needed. They didn't need anyone else's validation, not after everything they'd been through. They had each other, and that was enough. Little did they know, however, that this incident at the boutique wouldn't be forgotten so easily. The manager, still reeling from the shock of realizing who the woman was, would soon be forced to confront the consequences of her actions in a way that would affect more than just her career. The events set in motion by that simple mistake would soon ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could have anticipated. Later that evening, as Keanu and his wife returned to their peaceful home, the weight of the day seemed to linger. The quiet of their private space felt worlds away from the high-end boutique and the uncomfortable scene they had left behind. But while they tried to shake off the encounter, the events were far from over. The manager, whose words had caused the tension, was still reeling from what had transpired earlier that afternoon. Back at the boutique, the manager sat at her desk, staring at her phone. She couldn't shake the image of the woman, Keanu Reeves' wife, standing there, calm yet unbothered by the criticism she had been subjected to. It felt like the moment had burned itself into her mind, every detail sharp and unforgiving. Her words had been harsh, but it was more than that. It was the assumption, the judgment she had passed so carelessly. Now she felt like a fool. But it wasn't just her ego that was bruised. The more she replayed the situation in her mind, the more she realized something deeper. Her behavior wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a symptom of something bigger, of a system that often valued appearances over substance. She had been taught, whether consciously or not, to judge people by their outward appearance, by their clothes, their demeanor, and their status. She had assumed that a woman in simple attire couldn't possibly belong in the high-end boutique, not realizing that the very person she treated so badly was married to someone who was not only a star, but also known for his humility and kindness. The manager's fingers tapped anxiously on the edge of her desk. She knew she couldn't just let it go. She had to find a way to apologize, to make things right. But how? What would Keanu think of her now? Was this going to affect her career? She could already hear the whispers in the boutique, the rumors that would spread like wildfire among her colleagues. If she hadn't recognized who Keanu's wife was, would she have treated her the same way? Was her behavior really that shallow, that biased? As the hours passed, she found herself spiraling deeper into guilt. This wasn't just about a single customer. This was about the culture of the boutique, the assumptions that were ingrained in her mind, and the false standards she had learned to uphold. She wasn't the only one who had operated under these pretenses. Many of her colleagues had done the same. This was the way business had always been run, after all. Customers with money, status, and the right appearance were given the royal treatment. But those who didn't fit that mold, they were often treated with condescension, dismissed as less important. It was a harsh truth she had never questioned until now. The next day, as the boutique reopened its doors, the manager stood behind the counter, her mind clouded with uncertainty. She had rehearsed her apology over and over again, but nothing felt right. She wasn't sure if Keanu and his wife would even return to the store. After all, what reason would they have to? The incident had already left a stain on her reputation, and she couldn't undo what had been said. But she had to try. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least attempt to make amends. Meanwhile, Keanu and his wife were navigating their own internal tension. After their quiet conversation at the park, they hadn't spoken much about the boutique incident. Keanu had respected his wife's space, knowing she would process things in her own time. But the truth was, she wasn't entirely unaffected by the event. In the quiet moments when they were alone, she couldn't help but replay the interaction. She knew it was just one person, one experience, but it felt like a bigger commentary on how society valued the wrong things. How people, especially women, were often judged based on their appearance or their status, rather than their worth as individuals. It wasn't the manager's words that stung the most, though. It was the realization that these kinds of moments weren't isolated. They were part of a bigger pattern, one that many women faced every day. She had seen it in the way people spoke to her in public, the way they assumed she was just another socialite or celebrity wife. She had lived her life in the background for a reason, to avoid the shallow judgments. But moments like these reminded her that no matter how much she tried to stay out of the spotlight, it would always find its way to her. Keanu, sensing the shift in her mood, knew there was more she wasn't saying. He had seen the look in her eyes, the subtle sadness that lingered. He had been a public figure for so long, used to the judgments and assumptions that came with his fame, but he also knew how much it affected his wife. She didn't want to be defined by her connection to him, and yet the world often refused to see her as anything other than Keanu Reeves' wife. He wished he could shield her from it all, but he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do was be there for her, offering support without pushing too hard. He would wait for her to open up when she was ready. But as the days passed, it became clear that the boutique manager wasn't the only one who was grappling with the fallout from the incident. The boutique had already begun to feel the ripple effects of the interaction. Word of the incident spread quickly among the staff, and there was a growing divide between those who sided with the manager and those who recognized the mistake she had made. Some of the employees, who had long been uncomfortable with the way customers were treated based on their appearances, began to question their own roles in perpetuating the culture of exclusivity. It was clear that the event had struck a nerve, and now the boutique was facing an internal conflict about its values and the way it treated people. While the manager remained fixated on her guilt, others in the boutique began to wonder if change was necessary. They had seen the consequences of the manager's actions, and they couldn't ignore the underlying issues any longer. Would they continue to cater to a narrow definition of luxury, or would they take a hard look at the way they did business? Was it possible for the boutique to become a more inclusive, welcoming space, or was it too far gone? The tension within the store was building, and nobody could predict where it would lead. Keanu and his wife, meanwhile, continued to move through their lives as best as they could, aware that the situation at the boutique was far from resolved. The events of that day had only scratched the surface of a deeper issue, one that would continue to bubble beneath the surface, slowly but surely, until it reached a breaking point. What would the fallout be? Would the boutique's culture shift? Would the manager ever find a way to redeem herself? The tension lingered, leaving everyone wondering how it would all play out. The tension in the boutique had reached a boiling point. The manager, though still haunted by her earlier mistake, began to notice that the atmosphere around her was shifting. The once unquestioned hierarchy in the store was beginning to crack, and murmurs of discontent spread like wildfire among the staff. Some employees, who had always been uncomfortable with the boutique's exclusive and judgmental culture, were now starting to speak up. The manager could feel the walls closing in as she realized that the very environment she had helped foster was starting to turn against her. Her thoughts were clouded with guilt, but also with the increasing pressure to act. The encounter with Keanu Reeves' wife hadn't just been a simple misunderstanding. It had brought to light something much deeper, something that challenged everything she had been taught about what luxury truly meant. She had treated a woman with such disrespect, based purely on her assumption of who she was, and now the weight of that mistake was weighing heavily on her. She had to do something to make it right, but every time she tried to plan her next move, she was overwhelmed with uncertainty. Could an apology ever be enough? Would Keanu and his wife even care to hear it? On the other side, Keanu and his wife had tried their best to move on. They had shared their thoughts and frustrations in private, and Keanu had done his best to provide his wife with the support she needed. But the experience had left both of them unsettled, and despite their efforts to let it go, the boutique incident lingered in the back of their minds. Keanu, for his part, didn't want to make a big deal out of the situation. He knew that his wife didn't want drama or confrontation, but part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. The fact that a person like his wife, who had lived her life with grace and dignity, had been humiliated in that way didn't sit right with him. He couldn't ignore the way the manager's attitude reflected a much larger issue. The boutique, which prided itself on offering luxury, had allowed a culture of elitism to take root. That was the true problem. It wasn't just a matter of one person's actions. It was a symptom of a deeper, systemic issue that made people feel small and insignificant if they didn't fit the mold. Keanu couldn't sit idly by, knowing that people like his wife were subjected to that kind of treatment on a regular basis. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't let it slide. The next day, Keanu decided to take matters into his own hands. He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but he also knew that silence wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would only perpetuate the very culture that had allowed the manager to behave the way she did. So he reached out to the boutique, quietly but firmly through his publicist. He didn't demand anything at first. He simply wanted to make sure that the staff understood the gravity of what had happened and how it had affected both him and his wife. The manager, however, wasn't prepared for the fallout that was coming. She had spent the entire night debating whether or not she should reach out to Keanu's wife directly. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. The boutique's owners were already aware of the situation, and whispers about the incident were starting to gain traction in the media. The manager knew that if she didn't act fast, her job, and the reputation of the boutique, could be at risk. She could already feel her position weakening, the uncertainty of her career hanging in the balance. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of a mirror, rehearsing an apology to Keanu's wife. She had written the words down, but they felt empty. No matter how many times she said them, she couldn't escape the realization that nothing she said would truly undo the hurt she had caused. And yet, she had no choice but to try. Her mind raced as she played out the possibilities. What if Keanu and his wife didn't accept her apology? What if they went public with the story, turning the incident into something much bigger than just a misunderstanding? The pressure was suffocating, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how close to the edge she was. Meanwhile, Keanu and his wife were preparing for their next steps. They hadn't made any concrete decisions yet, but the uncertainty was beginning to take its toll. Keanu knew that his wife was still struggling with the after-effects of the boutique incident, even if she wasn't showing it outwardly. She hadn't asked for anyone to fight her battles, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done, something that would send a message not just to the boutique, but to the wider world. As the day wore on, the tension between Keanu, his wife, and the boutique continued to build. They had no idea that their paths were about to cross once again in a way that would change everything. The manager, having been given one final chance to make amends, was nervously preparing for a meeting that could either redeem her or seal her fate. Meanwhile, Keanu and his wife, who had no interest in the drama, were nonetheless ready to face the situation head-on. The stakes were higher than ever, and it was clear that something had to give. The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, the impending confrontation seemed more inevitable. In the coming days, the boutique was going to find out just how much one simple interaction could unravel everything. It was no longer about a single employee's mistake. It had become a larger, more public reckoning with a system that had long favored the privileged and dismissed those who didn't fit its narrow standards. And while Keanu and his wife had their own personal stake in this, they knew the outcome of this battle could ripple far beyond the boutique's walls. The tension was palpable, and as the day of reckoning drew closer, the question on everyone's mind remained: how would it all unfold? Would the manager find a way to make things right, or would the consequences of her actions be far-reaching and irreversible?